recording. Thank you.
Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Katie Lawrence and I am a research assistant with the Counter Memory Activism Research Group. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are in Kjipuktuk, Mi'kma'ki, the current and historically unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. The territory is covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, which Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqiyik, and Passamaquoddy peoples first signed with the British Crown in 1726. I would also like to extend gratitude to the ancestors of this land, as well as the lands which you all come from. Further, as a participant in the Counter Memory Activism group, I would like to recognize that the research we complete and conversations we have surrounding collective memory, intergenerational trauma, and commemoration of difficult histories are not undertaken in a vacuum, but rather interconnected with our everyday lives on this land. Counter Memory Activism is an interdisciplinary research creation project between artists, museologists, curators, and scholars of genocide and memory studies, exploring the current questions and historical context of memory activism, as well as broader themes such as collective memory and the commemoration of heritage and difficult histories. This research project has been funded by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada's Insight Development Grant. This project is a partnership between the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design and the University of King's College in Kjipuktuk, Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. Tonight's event will consist of a speaking portion and a question period. Questions can be asked by viewers through the chat feature, but they will only be visible to the moderator, who will then pose selected questions to the speaker. Also, if you would like to have subtitles for the talk, please click the live transcript button at the bottom right of your screen, and you should see the option to show subtitles. Our next speakers are Cyrus Marcus Ware on March 19th at 7 p.m. and Catherine Martin on March 22nd at 7 p.m. The rest of the schedule for the speaker series can be found at countermemoryactivism.ca or on Facebook and Instagram at Counter Memory Activism. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Sarah Clift, a researcher on the grant and brilliant professor at the University of King's College, who will be facilitating tonight's talk with Dr. Michael Rothberg.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks so much. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening's talk, Michael Rothberg. Now, Michael is the 1939 Society Samuel Goetz Chair in Holocaust Studies and Professor of English and Comparative Literature at the University of California, Los Angeles. His latest book is The Implicated Subject, Beyond Victims and Perpetrators, from 2019, published by Stanford University Press in their Cultural Memory in the Present series. Now, previous books by Michael include Multi-Directional Memory, Remembering the Holocaust in the Age of Decolonization from 2009, Traumatic Realism, The Demands of Holocaust Representation from 2000, and co-edited with Neil Levi, The Holocaust, Theoretical Readings from 2003. Now, with Yasemin Yildiz, he is currently completing Memory Citizenship, Migrant Archives of Holocaust Remembrance for Fordham University Press. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Michael to Halifax, and I'm sure you'll join me in a hearty Nova Scotia welcome. Now, as for protocol this evening, Michael will speak for about 30 or 40 minutes, at which time the floor will be open to questions and discussions. So as Katie mentioned, please write your questions in the Q&A function, and I will return and find them there. So please join me in welcoming Michael to Halifax.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Sarah, for that nice introduction. Thank you, Sarah, Solomon, and Katie for inviting me to be part of this series. I'm really glad to be here and appreciate all the work that you did to make it possible. Let me join Katie also in acknowledging that here I am in Los Angeles on the campus of UCLA. and that this is also the traditional and unceded land of the Tongva and Gabrielino peoples. So I want to acknowledge those peoples as the traditional land caretakers of this region that we today call Los Angeles. And this acknowledgement, while of course insufficient, is I think important, and it's also relevant to the talk that I want to give today, as you'll see in just a moment. I'm going to share my screen, and also just one more comment. I'm like many of you, I think, or at least many of us in the US today, I'm feeling very much disturbed, I guess, by the racist and misogynist murders that took place yesterday against 6 women of Asian descent and 2 other people in Atlanta. And so that's also very much on my mind, and also not entirely irrelevant to some of the things I'll be talking about today. I just wanted to mention that. So let me share my screen and get going. And I am going to be kind of, well, so I've given the talk the name Memory Activism and the Implicated Subject. I'll be speaking for about a half an hour, as Sarah mentioned. I divided the talk into 4 parts. The first and last parts are quite brief, and the core of the talk is really sections 2 and 3. In section 2, I'll introduce a few of the main arguments from my book, The Implicated Subject. And then in section 3, I will draw out some of the implications of the notion of implication for thinking about memory activism, and hopefully connect to your project there, especially. So the book, The Implicated Subject, came both out of scholarly work I've been doing for many years, but also out of a kind of autobiographical impetus. On the scholarly side, it follows my book, Multidirectional Memory, and which was a book that was interested in the transnational and entangled legacies of different histories of violence, in particular, starting from the Holocaust and seeing how Holocaust memory had always been in a kind of dialogue with memories of slavery and memories of colonialism, especially in the age of decolonization. And in that book, I was primarily interested in the way that memories of experiences of victimization intersected and provided opportunities for sort of cross-identity and cross-national forms of solidarity. But after I finished the book, I started to become interested in other ways that histories might intersect and connect. And I started to become interested in exploring other subject positions beyond the position of the victim, which of course remains essential in any of these histories of violence. But I started to become interested in other ways that histories come together, in particular in relation to what I will call the implicated subject. And also in shifting from multidirectional memory to the implicated subject, the key category, though memory remains important, also kind of shifted from memory to questions of responsibility, historical and political responsibility, as I'll explain. And all of these questions about intersecting histories, about historical and political responsibility, have for me a strong autobiographical component. And I trace it back to a time in my early 20s when I remember very vividly having discussions and even arguments with other white Jewish people like myself about our responsibilities as US citizens for the founding crimes, as we often say, of the United States, in particular the genocide of indigenous peoples and also for slavery. And there was a kind of response that I would hear quite often from other people with sort of similar family backgrounds to me. What does this have to do with me? You know, I wasn't here when any of this took place. And in fact, my family wasn't even here when these things took place. We immigrated much more recently, long after slavery had ended, long after the initial settlement of North America. What does this have to do with me? And I knew that there were good arguments, and I tried to make them for why we bore responsibility nonetheless, but I didn't feel I really had a very developed vocabulary for thinking about that and explaining why that form of responsibility was so significant and how we should think about it, what it looks like in practice. And it was only many years later when I was working on the Holocaust and discovered the book by Karl Jaspers called The Question of German Guilt, Die Schuldfrage, a book by a German philosopher written immediately after the Second World War and the Nazi period, in which he was reflecting on questions of what he called German guilt or guilt, and trying to convince his fellow citizens that they bore a kind of responsibility for what had just happened, again, and was meeting with great resistance, including resistance to the legitimacy of the Nuremberg trial, which was going on at the same time. And what Jaspers did was to make a distinction between four forms of what he called guilt: the criminal, the political, the moral, and the metaphysical. And criminal guilt is for him the guilt of perpetrators of crimes. It's always individual. It always has to do with one's direct actions, one's direct responsibilities for a crime that one has committed. That's what he called criminal guilt. And he said, of course, not all Germans are criminally guilty of what has just happened in the Holocaust. But he said, we do bear political guilt by virtue of our membership, our belonging to the German people, by virtue of our citizenship. We bear a responsibility for how we have been ruled. And he also felt that people, of course, had an individual moral responsibility, regardless of the laws, the mores of the society in which they live. Their forms of moral responsibility, or moral guilt, as he called them, go beyond that. And finally, he had this notion of metaphysical guilt, the idea that we are really responsible for anything that happens to anyone, anywhere on the earth at all times. For me, the category of political guilt was particularly important for thinking about the questions I wanted to think about. And moral guilt, I think, comes in as well, because I do feel like we have individual forms of responsibility as well as collective ones that we can't simply look away from. Metaphysical guilt was less interesting to me, precisely because it's metaphysical, I suppose. But I was not fully happy with the vocabulary that Jaspers was using here, in particular his notion of guilt, which seems to me not quite the right word for the forms that go beyond criminal guilt. Criminal guilt makes sense to me in a kind of legal context, but when we get beyond that, it seemed to me, and here I also was able to draw on the thinking of Hannah Arendt, that the right word was really responsibility, and that what I was interested in especially was political responsibility, and in certain instances, moral responsibility. And so drawing on Jaspers and Arendt, I was able to, or eventually able to develop a kind of framework for thinking about these questions, which I went on to call implication and the implicated subject. So I want to turn now to a few of the main arguments from the book and just kind of lay these out for you. So my first argument in the implicated subject is precisely that we have lacked the right vocabulary for talking about different forms of indirect responsibility for historical and actual injustices and forms of violence. So I argue, first of all, that we need to enlarge our understanding of the actors involved in injustices and histories of violence beyond the most often invoked figures of victims, perpetrators, and bystanders. So the subtitle of my book is Beyond Victims and Perpetrators. And by that, I don't mean that we get rid of those terms. Of course, those remain essential as well. But I feel like it needs to be supplemented, and I feel like the bystander in particular is a very weak term. And so my notion of the implicated subject is really a substitute for and a stronger version of what has traditionally been called the bystander. I'm interested in how people enable, perpetuate, benefit from, and in other ways inherit histories of violence without being themselves direct perpetrators. In other words, without being criminally guilty in Jaspers's terms, but nevertheless being politically responsible. And so the implicated subject is meant to name that particular figure of political and historical responsibility. And the notion of implication is I use to describe how we are folded into events and structures, again, that we don't necessarily directly create or lead or guide, yet nevertheless participate in and are part of, and our lives are created within them. And it's the word implication is, as you can hear, etymologically closely connected to complicity. I draw on the South African American-based critic Mark Sanders on complicity there to talk about the way we're folded in to events. I think there are differences between complicity and implication. I can talk about that later. I want to emphasize that when I talk about the implicated subject, I'm really talking about a subject position. I'm not talking about an ontological identity. In other words, I think these positions shift, and I think they're multiple. And that's why I insist on the notion of subject position as opposed to identity. We, as I'll go on to say, occupy different positions in relationship to different histories and different structures, and I want to be able to mark that and also mark the possibility for changes as well. But these are very deeply inhabited subject positions too, and I don't want to deny that. They go all the way back, as it were, but they're not essential, I suppose is what I'm saying. They are potentially changeable. For me, the subject is a transmission belt. The implicated subject, at least, is a transmission belt of domination, someone through whom relations of domination pass through without, again, being necessarily the one who's guiding or initiating them. And there I draw on a really nice book by the Italian philosopher Simona Forti called New Demons. And I take that phrase, transmission belt, from her. So my second thesis then is that we need to think about implication and implicated subjects on two axes simultaneously. And that is what I call the diachronic axis and the synchronic axis. So the second thesis of the book is that dilemmas of responsibility include both historical legacies, diachronic implication, and contemporary inequalities and forms of violence, synchronic implication. Now, these are in practice almost always totally woven into each other, and sometimes in such a way maybe that it's even impossible to distinguish between the diachronic and the synchronic. Nevertheless, I find it useful analytically to hold on to this notion of these two different axes, and I think in a lot of circumstances these can be really clarifying, and I'll try to show you what I mean by that in a moment. Here is a sort of visualization of what I mean by these different forms of implication, the synchronic and the diachronic, and those that are kind of in a sort of a gray zone in between. So when I talk about enablers, or those who enable forms of violence, I'm talking about a present day synchronic relationship, right? Something that is happening right now. Again, when we are paying taxes that are being used to fight a war far away. That's an example of what I mean by synchronic implication that is being enabled by an implicated subject. On the sort of diachronic side, I'm interested in the way also that we inherit histories of injustice, and that live on in some sense in the past. And right now I've been calling these figures, this particular version of the implicated subject, successors. And I guess the kind of paradigmatic example for this sort of version of implication of the implicated subject is something like third, fourth generation Germans after the Holocaust, right? They bear a kind of responsibility by virtue of belonging to a particular national collective, a particular nation state. They are not guilty of what happened in the Holocaust, but they succeeded, they come after it, and by virtue of that successor relationship, bear a kind of historical responsibility. And then in the middle, you have a couple of categories, and these aren't necessarily meant to be exhaustive, but these are the ones I've been thinking about, which either work both on the synchronic, diachronic, and diachronic axes, or are even places where it's very difficult to tell the difference between them. So beneficiaries, I think, do work on both axes, right? We benefit both from relationships of inequality in the present, let's say global capitalism, sweatshop labor, which is happening far away, which again, we are not in charge of, we're not criminally guilty of, and yet we benefit from it. But we also benefit from the injustices and forms of violence of the past, right? We continue in the United States. If you are a white person, we continue to benefit from the historical fact of slavery, even though formally this ended long ago. And this is sort of the argument back to my earlier autobiographical example earlier. We are beneficiaries of slavery, even if slavery itself as such is no longer around. And perpetuators is a word that I use that I think functions in a couple of different contexts, especially. One is what I'd call long distance nationalism, the way that diasporic groups help to perpetuate certain nationalist projects, even if they are far from the source. I think of this, for example, in relationship to diasporic Jews like myself and our relationship to the state of Israel and the occupation of Palestine, where I think we are often perpetuators of that occupation, again, even if we are not directly perpetrating it. I can think of other diasporic examples there too. Turkish diaspora and the denial of the Armenian genocide, for example. I think perpetuator is also a useful term, or I've found it to be a useful term for thinking about settler colonialism as well, to go back to the land acknowledgements with which we started today's event. I think, and this is one of the places where I think the synchronic and the diachronic start to really bleed into each other and become harder to untangle, right? But I think even if we are not the initiators of settler colonialist projects, right, by virtue of occupying land that is settled, that has been taken away from indigenous peoples, we are perpetuating that act of settler colonialism, which continues very much into the present. Now, my next argument, though, is that, again, going back to the notion that the implicated subject is a subject position and not an essential identity, not a singular identity, I think that many people find themselves complexly implicated. And by complexly implicated, I do mean something fairly specific. I mean that some of us have, in certain circumstances, we have lines of connection, direct or indirect, both to histories of victimization and to actualities of perpetration or histories of perpetration. And I want to acknowledge that many of us are, in fact, complexly implicated. The fact that we may have connections to victims, say victims past, does not allow us to abdicate our responsibility in the present. It's not about that. It doesn't cancel itself out. But I think it's important in grasping a lot of complicated situations and conflicts and struggles that are going on in the present. I think these things have to be acknowledged. So I'm trying to visualize that a little bit too. And here I've got another chart. And I think that complex implication then can take place in relationship both to actual ongoing victimization, as well as what Mariana Hirsch would call post-memories of victimization. And that these forms of complex implication can happen in relationship both to synchronic forms of implication and diachronic forms of implication. So it's a somewhat complicated map, but in a moment I'll give some examples of what I mean by this. But for the moment, what I just want to try to draw attention to is the way that one can be, again, in some ways aligned with histories of victimization, either very personally or through family connections, that's the post-memory dimension, and yet at the same time still be inserted into structures and histories of violence and exploitation and inequality that render us implicated at the same time, and that these things can coexist. Again, to give the example that I mentioned a moment ago as an example of complex implication, I do think that very often from let's say the Jewish side, diasporic or even Israeli, there's a kind of complex implication that we bring to thinking about the occupation of Palestine. And here I'm using as an example a work by a British-Israeli Jewish artist named Alan Schechner. And these are stills from a video loop. So this is a loop that just kind of plays over and over again. And it starts with this image on the left, which is a very famous image from the Warsaw Ghetto of a young boy with German soldiers behind him, a roundup in the Warsaw Ghetto of Jews in Poland about to be sent to their deaths. And it's a very famous, iconic image from the Holocaust, which Schechner has digitally manipulated, which you realize as he zooms in on the picture. And what you see on the right-hand side is that in the hand of the Warsaw boy, as he's often called, you see a picture of a Palestinian boy being arrested brutally, kind of violently by Israeli soldiers. And then what happens is, as you zoom in farther, you see that the Palestinian boy is himself also holding a picture. And as it goes in closer, you see that what he's holding is the picture of the Warsaw boy. And then it zooms in on that, and this kind of loops and loops. And I'm particularly interested in this from the perspective of the artist himself, right? Again, a Jewish artist who at one point was a member of the Israeli army. If I'm remembering correctly. And I think it's a reflection in part on complex implication. It's saying that as Jews, we have these very powerful images and maybe even very powerful family connections with the Holocaust, which is only several decades in the past. But that doesn't mean that we can't also be implicated in other forms of violence that are unfolding in the present, right? Like the occupation of Palestine. And so I see this work as an attempt to kind of, among other things, to work through that position of complex implication and use it as the basis for creating or attempting to create new forms of solidarity as well. So just to give you again this map of complex implication with a few examples. And these are examples taken really from my own work and my own interest, and they're just meant as illustrations. And maybe you can think of other examples that you would want to discuss as well. So the sort of bottom left quadrant there is the one I've just been talking about of post-Holocaust Jews and the Israeli occupation. On the top right quadrant, this is related to a project that Sarah mentioned at the beginning on migration and Holocaust memory in Germany, where Yasmin Yildiz and I are looking at the way that especially Turkish Germans, so Turkish immigrants and their descendants, negotiate with Holocaust memory culture in Germany. So these are racialized immigrants who are in some senses victims of forms of racialized systemic and event-based violence in the present. At the same time, by virtue of being in Germany, by being members of German society, they bear a kind of diachronic implication in the history of the Holocaust as well. It's a complicated relation, and that's kind of what we're trying to work out in our project. A couple of other examples quickly of this sort of complex implication. Just to give an example of the mix of diachronic implication with post-memory. Again, American Jews with memories of anti-Semitism, with memories of the Holocaust, other forms of suffering in the past, nevertheless enter in the United States into a situation where they inherit responsibility for slavery, conceived here at least as a diachronic event, as one located in the past. Again, I think it's a bit more complicated than that, but for purposes of illustration. And then on the sort of top side, top left side, where victimization and synchronic implication comes in. Here I'm thinking of racialized immigrants, different from Germany now in a settler colony, right? Where you are both, again, victimized or potentially victimized by systemic forms of racism, while at the same time you are also settling land that has been dispossessed from others who were here before, from indigenous people, from First Nation peoples. So just to give you a sense of these kind of different possibilities within the realm of what I call complex implication. So let me move, paying attention also to time, to my third section, which is where I want to try to bring in the question of memory activism as it relates to the question of implication and the implicated subject. Take a sip of water, too. So this is an image from last year, from last summer, from the protests, the Black Lives Matter protests that followed the murder by police of George Floyd. And I don't think that BLM is itself primarily about memory activism, of course, but it does, I think that Black Lives Matter does use memory activist strategies, right? They use memory in activism, and that there's a strong component of commemoration of those who've been killed in any kind of Black Lives Matter protest or within the movement more generally. And so see here you see a picture, for example, of George Floyd. We have the kind of litany of names that we also associate of past victims of police violence and white supremacy more generally that one would find in the context of Black Lives Matter events. And here I notice also in the background there, the silence equals violence slogan, which was quite prominent last year, especially white silence equals violence, which I'll just say in passing, I think is partly about implication, right? This is silence as a form, not of criminal guilt, criminal perpetration, but a mark of how people are implicated in forms of racial violence. Now, my book was published before these protests, but it did respond to the earlier instantiation of Black Lives Matter that arose initially out of the murder of Trayvon Martin and the acquittal of George Zimmerman. And I talk about an example in that book that I want to introduce here, right in the introduction to my book, of what I think is a kind of interesting, provocatively useful, for reflection example of people responding to Black Lives Matter and raising the question of implication. So I want to kind of lead up into that project and then give a couple of other examples of memory activism and the implicated subject quickly as well. So I think when George Zimmerman, especially when George Zimmerman was acquitted for the murder of Trayvon Martin, one of the first responses was, and an understandable one, was what I call the logic of identification. And you'll all remember this, I think, or many of you will, right? The statement, "We are all Trayvon, I am Trayvon," right, was very widespread in a lot of different forms, including at protests and posters like this one as well. Now, there is a long tradition, and it's an honorable tradition, I think, in many ways, of this logic of identification motivating activism. So I think back to May 68 in Paris, for example, and this famous slogan, "Nous sommes tous des Juifs et des Allemands," "Nous sommes tous des Juifs allemands," as you often hear as well, which was about Daniel Cohn-Bendit, the French-German Jewish student leader who was being sort of considered foreign, and they were attempting to kick out of France at the time. And so students and others rallied with this slogan, "We are all German Jews," or "We're all Jewish and German." That kind of, again, logic of identification. You saw this also in recent years in Turkey, in responses to the assassination of the Armenian Turkish journalist Hrant Dink, a large protest that you see here in Istanbul with signs that say, among other things, "Hepimiz Hrantız, Hepimiz Ermeniyiz." We are all Hrant, we are all Armenia. So these are powerful acts of identification and can be very useful. But there are also limits, I think, to this logic of identification, which come quickly into view. One of them, I think you could see, for example, in this global slogan, "Je suis Charlie," after the horrible murders in Charlie Hebdo in Paris. While I would want to establish solidarity with the victims of those murders, for sure, I didn't feel comfortable, and I think a lot of people don't feel comfortable identifying with Charlie Hebdo. And I think we had another example of why that might be the case this week with that really horrible, very disturbing cartoon that some of you may have seen of Queen Elizabeth and Meghan Markle in the pose of the police officer and George Floyd. And so, you know, there are moments when one wants to be in solidarity, but without maybe establishing direct identification. Or another type of example, after the so-called Muslim ban initiated by Trump, there were huge protests all over the United States. Again, very powerful ones and very important ones. And a slogan arose initially, you know, "We are all immigrants." Well, we're not all immigrants. And so indigenous activists responded, you know, and said, well, no, it's a little bit more complicated than that, and offered another slogan, which some of you will remember as well, I'm sure, right? "No ban on stolen land," right? So, which I think, especially when spoken by those of us who are settlers, who are not indigenous, becomes a recognition of our implication, right? Of our, at the same time we want to and we will oppose this ban on immigration, we also have to recognize the way that we are implicated in a settler colony. And I think it was clear that in the Trayvon Martin case, again, that very quickly this form of identification, "We are all Trayvon," came under critique, right? And I think rightly so, right? We are not all Trayvon, right? We who are white we're not in the same position, and that slogan can tend to erase the differences between our different locations, and I think that can be a troublesome thing. In any case, what interested me was that the response to that critique of identification, one response was the creation of a social media project, a kind of memory activism, I would say, in the form of a website called "We Are Not Trayvon Martin." And this was an explicitly anti-racist initiative which gave people the opportunity to present themselves in images and or words, and to make statements that were clearly statements of solidarity with Trayvon Martin, but that did not pass through identification, which were premised on the idea, we are not Trayvon Martin. And yet here we are trying to take a stand in relationship to what happened. And for me, this became a really interesting thing to think through, not to idealize the project, not to claim that it had in some effect that it didn't necessarily have, but as a way to think about the question of implication and what it might mean for activism. And the project became a way of telling what I see as more complicated stories about race without sacrificing the anti-racist impetus that lay behind them. So you have things like a white mother of a Black child talking about how she is not Trayvon Martin and yet her son might be. Or people of color who are not Black, right, who are recognizing the sort of differential impact of different forms of racism. Or stories of passing, like the one on the top left, or on the bottom right, reflection on questions of privilege. So what interested me here again was an acknowledgement of implication as part of an activist project, part of an anti-racist project that did not feel the need to pass through identification, but through a kind of non-identification, which foregrounded the subject's own implication in these structures of racism, while at the same time kind of taking an anti-racist stand, being part of an anti-racist movement. Let me give now a couple of other examples of how I think implication and memory activism come together. This is a very recent example, also from Germany, by a Nigerian artist, Emeka Ogbo, who's based both in Berlin and in Lagos. And he's responding here to the questions of restitution, right, which have been very much on the agenda in recent years, in particular around the Benin bronzes, which were looted from Benin, now in Nigeria, at the end of the 19th century, and now can be found in museums all around the world, and many of them in Europe, and many of them in Germany, including in Dresden, which is where this intervention took place. And so Ogbo intervenes into this restitution debate, and it seems to me he does it not, so just to be clear, I'm not saying he's doing it from the position of the implicated subject. Rather, what I found interesting about this intervention was that it's addressed to implicated subjects. So it's another way that these things come together. He created a series of missing posters, which were hung, like, as you can see, in bus stops and other public areas around Dresden, referring to bronzes that are in the possession of the Ethnological Museum in Dresden, specifically. And his artist statement that accompanied this, again, I think speaks to this question of implication, right? In moving into the public domain with the instantly recognizable format of a missing poster, I hope to reclaim this issue as a post-colonial and societal responsibility. No one is exempt from the repercussions of colonialism. The society must act as a whole to repatriate artifacts that are simply not theirs. So I see this again as an affected party, right? An artist of Nigerian descent, who is specifically addressing the German public as implicated subjects, as implicated in the question of looted artworks and of restitution, and asking them to also see that they have a kind of responsibility, even though they are not either the ones who stole this or the ones in whom these things are directly in their possession, right? It's rather as citizens of Germany, as members of the society, they are nevertheless implicated in this question. And they're implicated, I think, in the form of beneficiaries in some ways, right? It's a recognizing that the treasures that are in our museums, insofar as they are stolen from somewhere else, render us implicated. They render us beneficiaries of acts of violence that took place in the past and in some ways are being perpetuated in the present. And I think I've been thinking a lot about, though I'm no specialist here, about museums and this question of restitution. I'm thinking that in some ways it might make sense, in certain circumstances like these, it might make sense to think about curators as, in some sense, perpetuators, not perpetrators in my vocabulary, but in some ways perpetuating these colonial relations that live on in a different form in the present through, among other things, these forms of stolen art and stolen properties, sacred properties in some cases, from former colonies. Let me give now a final example of memory activism and implication. This is drawing on work that I've done with Jennifer Noji, who is a PhD student in Comp Lit at UCLA. And we were looking at pro-migrant, I'm calling it, memory activism by Japanese Americans. And this was in the context of the so-called crisis at the border in the Trump years, where migrants from Central America were being detained and held in camps under really inhumane circumstances, as many obviously still are. And we looked at the logics that were being used by people who were active in support of migrants and against the detention policies of the state. And we found that there were kind of three logics at work, that you did find often identification with migrants from the position of victims or descendants. In other words, so again, we're talking about Japanese Americans, and there was a mobilization here of the memory of the Japanese American incarceration during World War II. So some people were acting through a kind of identification. The suffering of migrants and refugees today is similar to that which I or my ancestors went through during the Second World War in American camps. And this is a kind of multi-directional logic, I would call it. Other people also articulate, and people could articulate more than one of these at once. Another form of, another kind of activist logic was one based on what we call universal principles or principles of human rights, right? I'm here because this is a violation of universal principles. Doesn't really matter what my particular identity is. This is wrong, therefore I need to act. And then third, and none of these are more important than the other, just trying to unravel the different logics. Third, what we found was a not insignificant role for people who self-reflexively grasp their own implication in the present, and found that that was also a motivating factor for their activism. And one of my hypotheses is that complex implication, right? In other words, this fact of having lines of connection, both to histories of victimization and actual ongoing forms of implication in the present, can be a powerful motivating force for activism. It's not the only one, it doesn't have to be, but it can be. So just to give a couple of examples of what we mean by this third category of foregrounding and contesting one's own implication. Look, for example, at this image on the left-hand side and this poster that was made and distributed at a demonstration in Los Angeles, right? It says, "We already did this." And this is a reference specifically to Fort Sill in Oklahoma, which in the late 19th century was a kind of outpost of settlement and a place where Native Americans, including Geronimo, were being held. And then it was repurposed in 1942 for the detention and the incarceration of Japanese Americans, right, during the Japanese American incarceration. And then in 2019, it was proposed that the same Fort Sill would be used to hold child migrants and child refugees from Central America. In the end, the government backed off that, perhaps because some of these protests that emerged there. And I'm pretty sure that it didn't actually happen in this most recent instance. But of course, people were held other places nonetheless. What struck us about this was the slogan, "We already did this," which is rhetorical in a certain sense, but it's a rhetoric that actually places the speaker, the activist speaker, right, in a kind of identification, not so much with the victims, right, but with the perpetrators of these acts of these different acts of incarceration. So it establishes a kind of identity of the citizen with the state, and says, we therefore bear a kind of responsibility for what our government is doing, even though we're here protesting against it, right? And it's precisely from this position as implicated that we are protesting, right? That we are raising our voices. And I think you can see a version of that also in this quotation from one of the activists who was present in Los Angeles and had also been at a protest at Fort Sill itself, who said, "We had to go to be the allies and accomplices that our families did not have when they were forcibly removed from their homes. We were compelled to leverage our privilege as Japanese Americans to fight for those who are currently struggling under these incarceration systems." So again, this recognition that one can and sometimes must speak from a position of privilege, that is, from a position of implication, from the subject position of the implicated subject, to contest these very forms of domination that you find yourselves within in the present. And that doesn't erase either those historical forms of victimization that you or your family may have, or your community may have undergone as Japanese Americans, or again, thinking about the events of yesterday, it does not erase the racism and the violence of the present that you might also be suffering under, which has obviously increased in the time since this protest went on, that these things can overlap, right? That you can be both, you can have post memories of this past, you can have direct experiences in the present, and yet at the same time, you can also recognize that you are occupying position of some privilege in relationship to those who are being incarcerated right at this very moment. So this is, I would also say, this kind of combination of memory activism and complex implication, particularly in this moment in 2019, was not only found among Japanese American activists, but interestingly also, I think, among especially young Jewish American activists who were mobilizing a slogan associated especially with the Holocaust, never again, and repurposing it for the present, right? Never again means close the camps. So it's, I think, again, it's coming from, in some sense, a position of complex implication. It's saying we have these memories of victimization, we have these memories of the Holocaust, but if they're going to have any meaning in the present, they have to be mobilized against the forms of implication that today we find ourselves in, right, as more privileged subjects. So let me just conclude, and then I look forward to talking and questions. And this is very, very brief and in some sense still speculative. One of the things I've been thinking about recently is the relationship between affect and implication. And I think it's important for the memory activism focus as well, because one of the key questions is, for me, has been, how do you go from simply being an implicated subject to acting to try to transform that implication, to acting against your own implication? And here I think that the question of affect is really important. And so I think that affect works on three different levels in relationship to implication. I think that on the one hand, it can be itself a medium of implication. In other words, patriotism, love of country, is a way in which we become implicated in the crimes that our countries commit, that our nations commit. So affect itself is part of the sort of infrastructure, if you will, of implication. I think it's often in a kind of unconscious, sometimes conscious reaction against implication that we see, especially in expressions of resentment, as well as guilt and shame. And I think resentment is a really powerful thing that we have to tackle, that you see, especially in a lot of far-right movements today, but probably not only there. And to me, resentment is a sort of sign that, at least at an unconscious level, there's a recognition and then a rejection of one's implication in certain kinds of injustices. So the question is, what kinds of affect then get you out of that implication, right? That are not simply unconscious reactions against implication, but can turn into, that can be used to mobilize people in the direction of a kind of activism, whether memory activism or any other kind of activism. And I don't think that there's a simple answer to this. I don't think there's a singular answer to this. I don't think we can simply line up different affects with different responses. But here I think about this is something I want to think more about, but in kind of interrogating myself and thinking about myself and my own responses, I feel like anger itself is one of the places where where we can be motivated to act, right, to turn against the implications, forms of implication in which we find ourselves. Other people have suggested that guilt can play that role, or that shame can play that role. I'm a little more skeptical about those for the moment, though I'm willing to entertain those possibilities. And I think it's something worth talking about more. For me, at least so far, in interrogating myself, I find it's anger. It's when someone does something in my name, or from a category of which I am also a part, with which I strongly disagree. It makes me angry, and it makes me want to speak out and to act. And so something that I think requires more reflection, more theorization, as well as maybe kind of more empirical study as well. What is it that motivates people to become active and to become activists? So I will spoken long enough, if not too long, and I will stop there and look forward to discussion.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was excellent, super thought-provoking, and we have questions coming in. So I certainly have a few for myself. I agree with you, by the way. Anger is an excellent emotion, not enough productive anger around these days. But let me ask the first question we have in the Q&A. So the question, Michael, is the following. Could you please speak about the experience of diachronic successors as gendered memory activation? Is the word there? Maybe activism is meant, I'm not sure. I'll repeat that. Could you speak about the experience of diachronic successors as gendered memory activation or activism?
Yeah. I'm not quite sure that I'm quite understanding the question, to be honest. Or if there's a particular example in mind or context in mind.
I mean, if I can, I don't know what this.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking about, questions of gender as concerns memory activism. I mean, I'm thinking about the grandmothers of Argentina. I'm thinking about, so does gender play a role in particular forms of implication and or memory activism?
Yeah. I mean, I think that it certainly does. I think one has to, like, I try to offer what is obviously a kind of, in some ways, general framework that I think then needs to really be filled in by particular cases and particular histories. And I tried to give a few examples. In the book, of course, I give a lot more. I think, it's hard to speak generally about some of these things, but I mean, in the book, I draw, and I almost included this in my talk, but then I was aware of the time and that it was going to get too long. And so I did end up taking it out. But one of the inspirations for my thinking in the book is indeed the theory of intersectionality and intersectional feminism. And I draw in particular on the Combahee River Collective and their statement from the late 1970s. So they don't actually use the word intersectionality, but it's one of the kind of intellectual political origins of intersectional thinking, of course. And they were interested in, in theorizing the interlocking systems of domination that they, as Black women, experienced, and the simultaneity of those different systems of domination and how they impacted them. And I think that's obviously was and remains a very, very important project. And now it seems almost obvious, I suppose, but I think at the time was really revolutionary. In rereading the statement in the context of the work that I was doing on implication, what I came to see is that though it's not their concern and certainly not something they name as such, that they were also providing a kind of theory of implication in the implicated subject, precisely because of the way that these different categories of race, gender, class, et cetera, intersect. So they talk, for example, about how, as Black women, they find themselves allied with Black men, but that they also understand that Black men are, in my terms, not quite their terms, are implicated in patriarchy. Or they find themselves, necessarily working together with white women in feminist projects, but that white women are themselves implicated in white supremacy, right, in racist structures. And it seems to me that in theorizing in that way, and they call it, I think, especially in the case of white women, a mark of negative solidarity. Their implication in white supremacy is a mark of negative solidarity, which again, to me, is a mark of implication and a sign of being implicated. And so I guess for me, in these questions, one has to think precisely intersectionally, and one has to think about the intersection of these different categories, which is why, again, I think complex implication is such a, in fact, common phenomena and, in fact, important one to try to work through. Because I think it inflects the kind of work that we do as both intellectuals and as activists, and can be the source of all kinds of tensions and conflicts, as was the case, for example, in the feminist movement of the late 70s, early 1980s, when a lot of these questions really came to the fore. But I guess my hope is, by offering a sort of vocabulary for thinking analytically about some of these problems, that it can also have, I think also practical application is a little bit too strong a word, but can be useful in activist contexts for thinking about what the source of certain kinds of tensions and arguments and disputes can be. So I don't know if that, quite addresses either the initial question or even your follow-up on it. except to say that, I think both the way that we are implicated and the way that we respond to implication these are certainly gendered phenomena, as they're racialized phenomena as well, and
Yeah.
geopolitical and all of this.
Mhm.
And I do think we need to think through, I do think we need to think through these questions intersectionally, for sure.
Thank you. Thank you. We have another question from the Q&A. Well, let's say two from
Okay.
one person. It's say two-part question.
Okay.
The first part is, to what extent does the implicated subject rely on a sense of moral responsibility?
Mm.
How about we leave it there, because the other
Okay.
one is a little bit different.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is a question in itself.
Sure. Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. It's an important question, and not exactly an easy one. I guess what I would say at my first pass on the question would be to say that I offer the concept, or I'd like the concept to be seen, first of all, as an analytical category, as a way of thinking about violence and injustice in a broad sense. And in that sense, I think it doesn't necessarily refer to moral responsibility at all. In other words, I think that in the ways that we talk about violence, again, go back to my one of my very first points, we've had an imprecise vocabulary, and we've been lacking some key terms. And so I offer the notion of implicated subject first as a kind of analytical category that for me helps to make sense of how violence actually happens. And I come out of Holocaust studies, as you know, and in Holocaust studies, for some time, we've worked with this tripartite victims, perpetrators, bystanders category. But that seems to me, even in the very extreme case of genocide, to be inadequate as an analytical framework, as an analytical vocabulary for understanding how genocide works. Because in order for there to be killing on the scale and with the systematicity of something like the Holocaust and other genocides, you don't need just a large number of perpetrators or whatever number of perpetrators. You actually need a broad form of social implication, and you need implicated subjects at various moments, in various positions, at various levels, who are enabling this violence. Whether it's simply by looking away, which is maybe the classic bystander, but which again, I want to try to make a little more active, or by working in some sort of bureaucratic role, for example. So I don't think necessarily that people, for example, classic example from the Holocaust, who worked in worked for the railroad company in an office somewhere in Germany, facilitating the trains that took people to the death camps, can necessarily be called perpetrators, but they're certainly in my vocabulary at the very least implicated subjects. In other words, I'm not sure that you could bring those people to a court of law and put them on trial, but they do bear a kind of responsibility as implicated subjects. So first of all, it's an analytical category that I think is important regardless of questions of responsibility or morality. But of course, I do think it also is a question of morality and responsibility. And I think, especially then when we want to think about transformation and change, that even though I think transformation and change have to happen collectively, that I guess I don't think we can eliminate the kind of impetus that comes from a sense of moral responsibility as well, right? That before we act collectively, there also has to be a kind of light that goes off in our heads that says, wait a second, I'm not just a bystander, I'm not innocent here. I actually am implicated. I do bear responsibility for what's happening. And again, I think in most of the cases that I'm interested in, we're talking about a political responsibility, but I think that political responsibility is built on sort of individual moral responsibilities forms as well, if that helps a bit there.
Really?
And I think that's why I pointed to those two essays by Arendt. One is called Collective Responsibility, and one's called Personal Responsibility Under Dictatorship. And I actually kind of want to bring those together and think about the way that collective responsibility and, let's say, personal responsibility are actually really quite interwoven with each other.
Okay, we have the second part of that question
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
kind of, I think, follows
Okay.
on sort of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Is could you please offer a sense of how implication may be applied to the context of the climate crisis?
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. This is, I think that's also a really great question, and one I wish I had pursued further. I did, when I was working on the book, I wrote an essay, a kind of a preface for a volume called The Future of Trauma Theory, in which I talked a little bit about this question precisely. And I didn't really follow through with it in the book. And in some ways, I wish I did, though I guess there are lots of people working on this question. Obviously, it's perhaps the question or one of the questions of our times. There's no doubt about that. A lot of people are working on it. I'm not the world's greatest expert. I'm happy to have other people following through on this at the same time that, of course, it concerns me intellectually and as a human being. My first thought was that indeed, the question of implication and implicated subjects is, really works perfectly in thinking about the climate crisis, and that it's a different kind of diachrony, I suppose, right? So I'm used to think, again, as a Holocaust scholar, as someone who works on memory, I'm so used to thinking about diachronic questions and diachronic implication, in this case, in relationship to the past. But actually, diachronic relations go into the future as well. And I think the climate one is an interesting one where we're talking about things that have been done in the past, continued to be done in the present, that are already affecting the present, obviously, but that are going to continue to affect us in even more drastic ways into the future. So it has that kind of diachronic, both synchronic and diachronic dimension to it. I think implication is a potentially useful word insofar as I don't think it makes a lot of sense to think of ourselves as perpetrators of climate crisis or climate change. Just as I don't think it makes much sense to think of ourselves in terms of globalization and global capitalism as perpetrators of global capitalism. Most of us are not in the position to perpetrate either of these things, and yet we still participate and contribute to it. So in that sense, I think implication and implicated subjects does make a lot of sense for thinking about climate crisis. The reason I've then, since writing that initial essay, and it's a relatively short discussion of climate issues, but it's there, and I'd point to that. My piece is called Beyond Tancred and Clorinda, I believe, and it's available on my websites or wherever. Happy to share it with anybody who wants it. And I draw on both Rob Nixon and Dipesh Chakrabarty and some of the thinking that they have been doing. This was written some years ago. There's a lot more that's been done since then. In any case, since then, the reason I started to become a little more cautious and possibly skeptical is I'm not sure how much it makes sense to really talk about individual subjects, even taken collectively, in relationship to this particular crisis, which is so much a corporate produced crisis. And so what I want to make sure I wouldn't be doing if I were to pursue this is to somehow imply that the primary responsible figures, and perhaps here perpetrator is really the right word, are corporations, right? And the things that corporations are doing. Now, I guess, and I'd want to put more emphasis on that first of all. But I guess insofar as we as consumers and what have you, as taxpayers again, are contributing to the profits, et cetera, of these corporations and propping them up in that sense, then again, yeah, I think implication and implicated subject position makes sense once more. So I think it's actually a complicated question. I think there are people who know much more about this who'd weigh in more usefully than me, but I absolutely think it's worth thinking about and thinking through.
Thank you. Thank you. Another question from the Q&A pad here. Are you preserving the triad of perpetrator, victim, implicated subject? Or is the subject as such always already implicated, even though we need to distinguish carefully between various forms and degree of implication at the social and political level? Can there be a non-implicated subject?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think that I am preserving, I think I am preserving the triad. I'm trying to change a little bit the way we think about, or maybe a lot the way we think about it. I do think that, I do think that the positions of perpetrator and victim are essential positions. And maybe victim even more so than perpetrator, because it does strike me there's a kind of asymmetry. I think I talk about this a little bit in the book, where I think you can have crimes for which there aren't necessarily so many obvious perpetrators around, but yet there are still many victims, right? And so I don't know if a perpetratorless crime, exactly makes sense, but I think certainly there are instances in which implicated subjects are much more important than particular perpetrators, especially if we think about perpetrator in the mode of a kind of criminally indictable subject, because it could well be that no crime is committed and yet victims are still being produced. So there's a kind of asymmetry there, but in general, I think we need both of those categories still at the same time. That's a slightly different question than I think from the question of, are there non-implicated subjects? And here, I guess, what I would say is, on the one hand, it's hard for me to imagine a subject who would not in some sense be implicated. And again, not in any kind of metaphysical or ontological way, but precisely because we are social and historical beings, and we are born into social and historical circumstances that up until now are radically unequal and defined by various forms of structural violence. So in some sense, it's hard for me to imagine, and complex intersecting forms of violence. And for that reason, it's hard to think of somebody who wouldn't be at some level implicated. But I'm not sure that itself is such a useful insight. And so I think what is important is how we take the categories and apply them and use them and put them to work analytically. So I'm much more interested in, once the framework is out there, I think in thinking about how it applies to particular contexts,
Right,
to particular histories, to particular structures. And that one has to do a kind of reduction of complexity, I suppose, to get any purchase on matters that are important to us, right? So when I talk about the Israeli-Palestinian issue, for example, as I did today, right, to say that as Jews, we might be complexly situated, both inheriting post-memories of the Holocaust while being implicated in unfolding forms of violence in the present, I think to do that analysis, you have to, in some ways, kind of factor out a lot of the other things. We're also implicated in other ways. We also might be victims in other ways. But to make sense of that particular situation, you have to zero in on the most salient axes, right? You have to zero in on the most salient forms of violence that are at stake there. And so I think we have to make those kinds of distinctions, both, again, intellectually and politically. We have to choose our struggles, so to speak, and we have to choose which are the issues we're going to tackle at a particular time. So, and I think that's one of the, intersectional thinking forces us to think more complexly, but I also do believe at certain moments we have to sort of focus in and say, okay, in this instance, here's what's really, really important.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. If I can we've got a couple of questions, but I figure since I'm in the driver's seat, I can.
The prerogative, yeah.
I know. Michael, I wanted to, that's very helpful, I think, that question of, I love this idea of complex implication, because it does allow for a kind of differentiation. I'm drawn to, Hannah Arendt's sort of critique, as you know, of the idea of collective guilt. And she says very famously, if we are all guilty, then no one is. Right. And I do wonder if, when taken as a kind of abstract category, that the same risk is there with implication. We are all implicated, therefore, in some way, no one is. But I really like that kind of complicating the notion of implication through questions of intersection, questions of context. What is the most pressing thing at this particular right? So that kind of thing. So let me just get to, we have a couple more questions if you still have the energy.
Sure. Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So this one from the Q&A, perhaps it is worth observing that diachronic memory / intergenerational transmission of memory often happens through highly gendered vectors and codings. Memories of rape or various forms of gendered humiliation aren't spoken of as such, but emerge in particular kinds of maternal or paternal warnings or elaborate familial silences. So the affects that motivate us also have profound unconscious fore and afterlives, even at the national level too. So the subject is always complexed and implicated by trauma, pinned, so to speak, by inherited affects as well as our own. I guess that's the question. Is the subject always kind of complicated and implicated by trauma, pinned, so to speak, by inherited affects as well as their own?
Right. I mean, I think that was a beautifully articulated statement. And I think for certain contexts, like the context that were evoked there, context of, say, sexual violence, and that could be in the context of war, or it could be in the context of the family, ordinary forms of sexual violence of that sort, then I think what was described there makes a lot of sense. I mean, so, interestingly, I just did an interview last week for a project in Hungary about wartime rape, and they are trying to create a memorial for wartime rape, precisely, I think, for the reasons that were, one of the things that was stated in that comment question about the way these things are so often silenced and so often not brought into the present. So they're thinking about how those sorts of very ubiquitous and yet very difficult histories can be commemorated, can be brought into public. And I don't claim to be, again, an expert in this area particularly, but they approached me because they thought that this notion of implication could be useful for thinking through some of those forms, specifically forms of gendered violence in that way. So I was glad to have the chance to talk to them. The question for me, or the comment, is seems to be coming more out of this question of intergenerational transmission of trauma. And I make a kind of distinction, and again, it's an analytical distinction, and it's not meant to say that these things don't, again, overlap. But I distinguish what I'm talking about here in terms of diachronic implication from post-memory and from what I would call the intergenerational transmission of trauma on the side, again, of victims. And one of the things I was trying to do in this book was to offer a vocabulary precisely for thinking about the other side, so to speak. In other words, how are things intergenerationally transmitted on the side of perpetrators as opposed to the side of victims? Now, I know that post-memory sometimes is used to describe both, and Mariana Hirsch sometimes does that, though obviously her own work is mostly focused on transmission on the side of the victims, as it were, and survivors. But for me, I find that I want it both for, I think, moral reasons, but also conceptual reasons. It seems to me that these are, and political reasons, that these are different forms of transmission. And so what I talk about as diachronic implication is meant as a way of thinking about what on the side of the victims we call post-memory or intergenerational transmission of trauma. Now, again, because these things are often complicated and overlapping, and the Israel case would be, I suppose, a very good example of that, obviously, in practice, we have to be able to think of them simultaneously, and as well as kind of tease out the different strands. I do think that, and that's what I was trying to get at a little bit in my very last slide, and again, this is sort of, I'm still very much at the beginning of thinking about this, but I do think that unconscious affects are very important to the question of all these different questions of implication as well as post-memory. And that, again, thinking more on the side of implication, and that's where I'm thinking about shame and guilt and resentment as marks of implication, as unconscious reactions against recognition, disavowals in a sense of implication. So I do think that's there, and I do think that's very important. I don't think that we're all, I don't want to absolutize the notion of trauma, right? Just as we don't want to absolutize the notion of guilt. And I think you're right, Sarah, that there's a risk of sort of absolutizing the notion of implication as well. I think similarly, I don't want to absolutize the concept of trauma. I think it's very applicable in certain situations, very important in certain situations, and needs to be worked through in certain circumstances. But again, coming from the side of implication, I'm hesitant to move too quickly to talk about trauma, because I think there's a risk of appropriating that language from the victims to use, among those who are not the victims, who may be perpetrators or the descendants of perpetrators. And that doesn't mean that perpetrators aren't sometimes traumatized. I do believe that there's a category called perpetrator trauma. I do believe that there can be inherited forms of trauma, that work intergenerationally on the side of perpetrators as well. I'm not denying any of that, but I guess I do want to be careful about mixing that in with the forms of trauma that happen on the side of victims and within the families of descendants of victims.
Thank you. Thank you. We have a question. Oh, and it just disappeared. Oh, there it is. About art.
Okay.
Maybe two more questions.
Sure.
Yeah,
that's fine. That's great.
Okay, wonderful. So the question is the following. Can you speak more broadly, perhaps, about the radical potential of artists to draw out the complexities of being implicated?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Art is really important so first of all, I'm a literary critic and a cultural critic. So I tend to work through all of these questions through culture and through cultural texts of various sorts. And even though I'm trained as a literary scholar in particular, I have been more and more drawn to visual art in recent years. And so there's a lot of, in my last two books, really, a lot of my examples are taken from either film or visual art of different sorts. I guess I tend to think of art as particular, in a way, as a form of theory. I guess I have to admit that I see it as a place where thinking happens, and that where, as a critic, I can think more complexly through art and through various forms of textual examples of different sorts. There are different artists who've been important to me, and I guess the one that I would mention here in response to this question is William Kentridge, the South African Jewish artist. And I often use examples from him when I talk about this topic, and there's a long chapter in my book about Kentridge, and it's in the section on complex implication. And the reason for that is that he is a white artist, a white South African artist, but also a Jewish South African artist in a country that has its own tradition of anti-Semitism, and in which a good number of Jewish South Africans have family relations or are themselves, even, but now it's the older generation, direct relations to the Holocaust. And so you have memories of this sort of anti-Semitic or genocidal violence, for sure. But of course, once you are in South Africa, you were recognized as white, and you became affiliated with and aligned with the white minority and all of the privileges that came with the apartheid system. And I see Kentridge, what I love about Kentridge, and I think this gets really to the question, is the way he uses formal means to work through complex implication, right? So that his images, and I particularly look at his handmade animated films, which he does through this kind of drawing and smudging process that leaves various layers of images in the films that he makes, and sort of chalk dust and all of this stuff, these palimpsests. And so he sort of develops his own medium, which is a medium that precisely allows you to visualize historical complexity and historical layers. Mm-hmm. And he then uses these sort of alter ego figures, these two figures that appear in this whole series of films called the Drawings for Projection, to work out questions of implication. And I'm particularly interested in the way that he stages himself through this mining magnate called Soho Eckstein. And it was a very unpleasant character who who owns these mines that Kentridge depicts as looking like concentration camps, right? That really look like Nazi camps, and that also in his films echo the relations of slavery very explicitly. And so it's a very multi-directional work, but it's also a work that explores complex implication, and it does it at the formal level, not just at the thematic level. And I guess that's, for me, is what is so important about art, is precisely the way that artists work with form, which allows for a kind of complexity and ambiguity, and ambivalence, to get back to some of the affective questions, which I think is really important when confronting relations of implication, and particular complex implication.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that question of ambiguity around sort of the ways in which our thinking of identities as categories maybe foreclose a kind of thinking of implication that artists can open up.
Yeah, and that doesn't make it less urgent, right? I think, thinking complexly and ambivalently doesn't mean it's not urgent, doesn't mean that we can't and shouldn't act, but that it helps us to, it helps us to develop, I think, more complicated maps of the social, I suppose, which then can feed into more directly activist projects.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, one last question, and it comes from Katie Lawrence, one of our wonderful researchers, student assistants on the project. So she writes the following: I'm interested that you think individuals working in German bureaucracy could not be put on trial for the crimes of the Holocaust when their actions were actively facilitating genocidal violence in their time.
Yeah.
This appears to me, she says, as a radically different degree of implication than the implicated subject category you outlined. The extent to which their perpetration was unknown to them seems to have been a result not of physical or temporal distance from the consequences of their action, but from an actual cognitive dissonance in relation to or misunderstanding of the criminality of their actions. Can or should this category of the implicated subject be applied to such instances of non-thinking or a lack of critical thinking on the part of perpetrators?
Yeah, thank you, Katie. I think that's a great question. A really important question.
Yeah.
In a way, it's easy for me to answer the part where I would say, no, that kind of cognitive dissonance is not, I don't think that excuses anyone from anything, right? In other words, and I think that would go both for perpetrators and implicated subjects. To me, it doesn't matter whether you realize you're implicated for you to be implicated, right? I think we are all, and I think some of it can be, again, psychic forms of disavowal. But I think sometimes we simply are not in a position to know what the entailments of some of our actions and forms of participation in society are, because they are indeed happening far from us, in places that we have no ability to perceive, in a certain sense. Maybe we should know, but in some sense we don't know, and it's not necessarily because of particular psychic processes of disavowal or repression or anything like that. So I don't think that cognitive dissonance is any kind of excuse. Now, in terms of the particular example, I'll admit that I actually don't know. Are these, for me, in a sense, the test of whether someone is a perpetrator versus an implicated subject, and maybe this isn't a good test, but this is the one I've used for myself, is, are they indictable, right? Can they be brought, can they be put on trial? In the case of people who are participating in bureaucracies in a genocide, I just don't honestly, in some ways, I just don't honestly know what the legal norms or guidelines for such figures would be. It seems to me at least likely that some of those who participate in these bureaucracies are really not, by whatever extended sense of legal responsibility we might have, are not criminally responsible. Now, it could be that it's also, in some of these cases, like in the case of the Holocaust, simply a matter of practicality, that it's not practical or pragmatic to put on trial these many hundreds of thousands of people working behind the scenes, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be put on trial. And I'm willing to accept that. And so it's possible that's simply not a good example. But it does seem to me that there are, in various scenarios of violence, including the Holocaust, many, many people who are playing different kinds of indirect roles, both within the state and outside of the state and civil society, who I don't think it makes sense to think of in terms of criminal guilt, but I do think it makes sense to think of in terms of both political responsibility and moral responsibility, I suppose, as well. So it's partly an empirical question, for legal scholars. Can such and such a category of participant in some act of violence or history of violence, is this category legally indictable or not? If they are, then okay, we can think about putting them on trial and holding them criminally responsible. And then I think you're right that they're not really implicated subjects in my terms. Or are they really outside of criminal punishment and therefore occupy some other position of political and moral responsibility, for which I offer the category of implicated subject? I'll say, and then maybe a final point related to this is, I'm also not sure that pursuing criminal guilt and holding people criminally responsible is always going to be the right solution in any case, even if we could. And here I'm thinking about the kind of challenge that comes from abolitionist quarters today in asking us to rethink the whole criminal justice system as such, right? And so I guess I don't, and again, I'm not knowledgeable enough and haven't thought it through far enough to make any kind of definitive claims about this, but just to say that I want to hold in abeyance the idea, I don't want to imply in making this distinction between criminal guilt and implicated subjects and political responsibility, that I'm necessarily always on the side of prosecution and criminalization and incarceration, even of perpetrators. And an interesting book along these regards that I'm in the middle of reading, and so also kind of reserve judgment on still for the moment, is Mahmoud Mamdani's new book, Neither Settler Nor Native, where he's arguing, and I cite some of his earlier work in my book, and in some ways there's real overlap with what we're doing, though I think he also goes in some other directions, where he argues against the Nuremberg paradigm as a way of thinking about justice and transitional justice in particular. And I kind of agree with him. And the problem for him is that this is not a political solution, but it's precisely a criminal justice legal solution, which is inadequate to understanding these forms of mass violence like you have in the Holocaust. That's one of the examples. In settler colonialism, in apartheid South Africa, again, these are some of the examples that he uses. So I actually think, yeah, there's a need to think more and further and maybe more radically about what we even mean by criminal guilt and criminal responsibility, aside from the question of distinguishing between perpetrators and implicated subjects. But I guess even as we're doing that, the distinction between these categories for me is still an important one, even though, as Katie's example implies, we may have differences of opinion about who falls into which category. And so I take that point and I take it seriously. And thank you for the question.
Thank you, Michael. Well, I think maybe that's Katie's excellent question, and the thoughtful response is maybe a good place to end our session with Michael tonight. So allow me, Michael, to thank you on behalf of the whole research team and our audience tonight for spending some time with us here on the East Coast. I hope you've enjoyed the weather. And to you audience members, if I can, just a quick reminder, please, if you're interested in what you've heard and would like to pursue questions from all different angles of this kind, then please come back tomorrow at 7 p.m. to hear a talk by Cyrus Marcus Ware. And then again on Monday, we've got a lot coming at you. Monday, March 22nd, for a session with Mi'kmaq filmmaker Kathy Martin. So thank you so much for coming, and we'll close there.
Thanks for having me.